Well, today we're starting a brand new series, and we ran out of cool titles, so we're just calling it brand new. How's that? What do you think? No, not really. About 13 years ago, many of you know, we started a brand new church, and if you're here today, you're sitting in it. Actually, I have no idea how old this building is. I should know that. I have no idea, but I think, as we all know, the church is the people. And this little community called Brookview was started in 2003, and we met at Linwood High School for 12 years, set up and tear down and Mr. Dale and the whole deal. And then we moved into this building last November. And so this building isn't brand new, and our church isn't really brand new, but at one point we were. And Jen and I we moved down here from Bellingham, and we started this thing from nothing. It was really just the two of us and our two kids. And the vision from the very beginning was to do church in a certain way, to do it in a way that challenges those that are followers of Jesus to really live out their faith, but also to do it in a way that is inviting to people on the outside, okay, people who have yet to put their faith in Jesus. We're trying to balance those two tensions all the time. And so we said, let's try to dispense with all of the non-essential stuff in church that kind of gets in the way sometimes. Let's try to keep it simple and informal. Let's make it about an authentic little community of people that are learning how to be real together. Let's use language that you don't need to have grown up in the church to understand. And let's not have a bunch of rituals that wouldn't make sense to an outsider. Let's try to dispense with anything that isn't essential that might get in the way. Now, the thing is, 13 years ago, when we were doing this, some of you know we were not alone. Okay, this is not like a brilliant idea that I had one day. Lots of church leaders in that time frame were really rethinking church. They were trying to let go of non-essential stuff that sometimes gets in the way. And so Brookview is a part of a very informal but very large, broader movement. And in the last few decades, lots of stuff, you may have noticed, has changed in church culture, right? I mean, let's start with the music. Are you kidding me? I mean, you don't really see, at least in a lot of churches, you don't really see hymnals around anymore. Some of you are like, what's a hymnal? Now, we may sing some hymns, but it's not from a book that's in the chair in front of you. Like where, you have to try to find the page number, and by the time you figure out what it is that everyone's singing and you get on that page, like the song's over. There's no more hymnals, okay? The words are on a screen, and this is true of many churches. They're on a screen with these artsy, oftentimes moving backgrounds. And lots of times there's like beautiful flowing water somehow behind the words. It's oceans or streams or rivers. And that can be a little tough, like if you drank too much coffee before church, right? And you're just like gritting your teeth trying to hang in there and make it through church. Church is going long, and there's a river up there. There's no hymnals. And it feels very different. And most churches don't really use just the instruments. Most churches don't really use the organ anymore. I mean, not mainstream anyway. It's guitars, it's electric guitars, it's bass and drums. The musical style now reflects the preferences of the people in the culture in which we live. Sacred words, okay, but familiar musical style. Church architecture has changed. Much more simple structures. And sometimes you look and you go, that doesn't look like a church at all. Like it meets in a high school. I mean, that can't be a church. It meets maybe in a strip mall. And then there's a whole lot less liturgy. Like stand up, sit down, recite this, make these motions. It's more about simple teaching and worship and community. It's become way, way more casual. And you don't see choirs very much anymore. You don't see robes very much anymore. You hardly even ever see suits. But I'll tell you what, there's part of me that goes, man, I would rock a robe. I mean, can you envision it? But that just doesn't happen. It just is so unusual. Can you guys imagine walking in here and I would come up and with these like decadent robes? Now, the preaching is just way more conversational. Pastors in general are a lot more humble, aren't they? They're not pointing and they're not yelling at everyone. The people, they are people that really, for the most part, are in the struggle with you. They're not standing up above you in judgment over you. Now, these are really good things. And of course, this is not true everywhere, but it is way more the norm than it used to be. In the last 20 years, there has been a pretty massive reform in church culture. Now, Jen and I were in Russia, as many of you know, a couple weeks ago, and we visited this magnificent, just epically large, beautiful Orthodox church in St. Petersburg. And they happened to be holding a church service while we were there. So it was like this really authentic Russian Orthodox experience. And there was a priest in a robe up in front, and he was singing the message. And it was like echoing off of these just magnificent pillars and structures all throughout this vast expanse that they had there. And he had this like amazing, powerful voice. And in that moment, I realized something. I realized I could never be the pastor of this church. Come on, that was funny. And so this guy's singing from up front with all the robes, and then back there was this perch. I don't know what they call it, but there was this perch in the back, and there was this little choir of like 8 or 10 people up there singing. And the priest would sing, and he would give like the call, and then the choir would be in the back, and they would give like the response, and it would just go back and forth like this. It was just sounded so sacred, and it was really beautiful. And then the Bible stories were painted in murals all over, all throughout the cathedral. They were even painted up on the ceiling. When you look up, you're like, whoa, that is breathtaking up there. And they hired like the most famous artists of the day in Russia to do these things. They even brought some people from other nations to come in and paint these things. And so the sacredness, the awe, the extravagance. You look around and there was literally gold leafing everywhere. Everything's just like covered in gold. And so I'm looking at this going, I cannot imagine how expensive this building was to build. And while a lot of our group was just like filled with awe and reverence, to be honest, for me, as I sat in there, I mostly felt sad. Like the language of the songs and the message. You're not going to believe this, but they weren't in English. But here's what might be more surprising. They weren't in Russian either. It was this ancient language that nobody actually speaks anymore. And so the point wasn't that the words would instruct or encourage or challenge or equip people for living a life like Jesus. The point was to walk into this holy temple and feel the holiness of it, right? To watch a professional religious guy do religious stuff in a language that common people don't even understand. And so I'm standing there and I'm taking it all in. And one of the many guards, which are located all around this place, to protect all the paintings and all of the relics and stuff, a guard walks up to me and he looks at me and he glares at me. I can tell like he's mad at me. And I'm like, dude, what? I'm just standing here. So finally he gets over to me and he goes like that. And I realized, oh, I had my hands in my pockets. I'm like, oh. So I look around the room and I realize as all the people that are used to Orthodox services are in there, they're standing there and their hands are all out like this because it's irreverent to God to put your hands in your pockets, apparently. Right after that, a pastor friend of mine kind of made his way over to me and he was just looking around, looking up at all the extravagance, and he's kind of shaking his head. And I sensed that he was feeling the same thing that I was. And so I said, hey, man, do you think this is what Jesus had in mind? And he just shook his head, and he was like, no, this is actually making me sick. Now, I don't say this to judge anyone. I know people have different traditions and different things that are meaningful. And I'm not trying to be critical at all, but I think we need to constantly, as followers of Jesus, constantly go back to an important question. When Jesus said, I will build my church, what was it that Jesus had in mind? What was he envisioning? And the goal in me asking that isn't to evaluate some church in St. Petersburg. The question only matters in relation to what it is we're doing, how Christians are living and behaving in our churches, okay, in Seattle, in Briar, at Brookview. And the church in St. Petersburg really serves only as a catalyst for the question. And as I think about this, I start to really wonder if maybe, just maybe, even with some of the really good recent changes that have happened in church cultures, if maybe we are still holding on to things that are holding us back. And when I think of the church in our context, when I think of churches like ours, churches attempting to let go of anything that might be holding us back, even with all of the progress we've seen, I wonder if we have a whole lot farther to go. And I wonder if we are simply holding on to things that are holding us back. Now, if you're here today and you're like, I'm not a church person. You know, maybe you've had a bad church experience. Something has really gone wrong, or some experience with Christians that you've known. And you don't really like Christians. I bet you have a really good reason for that. And I bet that if you came up here and you told us your story, it would really make sense why you feel the way you feel. And so if that's you, I just want to say, this is the perfect message series for you to come to and be a part of. Because here's what we're going to discover over the next 3 weeks. Most of the things you resist about church, if you're someone who resists church, most of the things you resist about church are the things the church should resist in itself. Most of the things that a person generally resists about church are the very things that we as a church ought to be resisting in and of ourselves. And so we're going to spend some time talking about some of those things, and this is going to get interesting. And some of you might get a little bit uncomfortable. This might get a little bit emotional. But that's okay, because this is a really important question. Now think about it this way. From an outsider's perspective, okay, not from a church person or from a Christian, from an outsider's perspective, what even is the church? What is a church? Well, from an outsider's perspective, a church really, when you think about it, a church should be nothing more than this: a community of people who follow the teaching of a man sent from God to explain God and to clear the path to God. I mean, that's pretty much what an outsider should think about the church. Simply this: a community of people who follow the teaching of a man sent from God. And an outsider may disagree with that. Okay, they may not believe that. But they would understand that this is what we believe. A man sent from God to explain God and to clear the path for us to God. And now you think about that and you go, well, what is there to resist or to passionately dislike about that? Like you don't have to agree, you don't have to like it, but you shouldn't really have a lot of negative emotions swirling around that unless somehow, some way, there's a whole lot more to it than that. And not only are we a community of people committed to following this guy who explained God and cleared the path to God, but you think about it, what was his primary directive? What was his big, here's what I want you to do. Here's how I want you to live then. Well, his top 3 commandments, really it's one commandment with 3 applications, was this. Now, how threatening was this? Love God, love one another, and love your enemy. Guys, what in the world is there to resist about that? There should be nothing threatening or scary to outsiders about that. Now, outsiders might question our beliefs about Jesus. That Jesus Christ is the Son of God, okay, God in the flesh, that he's the King and that he deserves our ultimate loyalty. Outsiders may not agree with that, okay, and that makes sense. But what else in the world about what we're doing should be threatening to those outside of us? And here's the cool thing. For the first 300 years of Christianity, okay, so for the first 300 years after Jesus, when the church was brand new, the primary thing people resisted about the church was exactly that. That was it. Christians were persecuted because of their ferocious loyalty to Jesus. Christians said that Jesus is Lord and we have no other. Now, we will respect and we will obey human leaders as long as they don't ask us to disrespect or disobey Jesus. But we will only worship Jesus ever. But when Caesar is not only a king, but also a God to be worshiped, then it's like, uh-oh. This we only worship Jesus deal doesn't fly very well if you live within the Roman Empire. And so Christians were martyred by the thousands. But see, they weren't martyred because they had weird music. It wasn't because everybody thought they were so judgmental. It wasn't because they were exclusive or they all came off as superior. It was because of their unyielding loyalty to Jesus. That was it. It was because they said, hey, as nice as we can possibly be, as community-minded as we are, as much as we care for orphans and for widows and for the poor and for the sick, at the end of the day, as much as we do the best that we can to love even our enemies, we believe that Jesus is our King and we will not worship anyone or anything else. Well, in a kingdom that had a God King, that didn't fly very well. And so it was dangerous to be a Christian. It could cost you your life. And yet, through the first and the second and the third centuries, in that environment, Christianity exploded. Like it was oppressed, it was persecuted, it had no power, it had no prestige, and yet people came to it by the millions. And the criticism of them was pretty much this. They think Jesus is God and they won't worship our gods or our emperor. Now, you think about that. And you think about our culture and the brand that we have in our culture. Wouldn't it be cool if the only negative thing that people in our culture had to say about Christians was, you know what? They're great people. They're great neighbors and great friends, and they're great workers and co-workers. They're great as Little League coaches. You should see them coach Little League. And they're great nurses, and they're great doctors, and they make our communities better in just unspeakable ways. The way they care for the poor and for the hurting and those on the outside is unreal. The way they show grace and forgive, and it's unprecedented. But they think Jesus is God, and man, so I can't handle that. Just think about it if that was the primary criticism of us. Imagine if the only thing that people complained about us is that we have this extraordinary devotion to Jesus. But I'll be honest with you, in my lifetime, and I've talked to a lot of people, I truly haven't ever heard anyone say, the only reason I resist church, the reason I don't like Christians, is because of what they believe about Jesus. That's never the real complaint that people have. Guys, we should be irresistible because of how we live. Like irresistible. Except for our super extreme beliefs about Jesus, whatever else about us should draw people. And whatever else it is about us that's resistible might just need to be something that we resist in ourselves. Now, the truth is, Christianity has developed quite a brand. And when people hear the word Christian, when they think Christian, there's a whole slew of negative stuff that comes with that. My question is, based on what Jesus taught, love God, love one another, and love your enemy. based on how Christianity started, like in its purest form, the first 300 years of people living those things out, like you look at our faith and the state of the way things are, what in the world has happened? How did we get from the teachings of Jesus to where we are now? And I think many of you, along with me, we've been wrestling with this stuff for years. But when I was in that church in St. Petersburg, it hit me. Like it really, really hit me, that single question, is this what Jesus had in mind? And I've been thinking about this a ton lately. And then a while back, I came across a sermon series from Andy Stanley. And he talks about this stuff in a way that makes so much sense, and it's so compelling. And it takes so many of the thoughts that I've had about church history and current trends and helps me kind of put it in a teachable framework. So I'll tell you right up front, I am indebted to Andy Stanley for much of the framework of this series. But in the time that's left today, I want us to think about this critical question. Guys, what in the world has happened? How did the church become so resistible? And here's what we're going to discover together. As we really look at this, we're going to see that resistible factor is not really the result of new things being added. It's really the result of old things creeping their way back in. Things that Jesus came to overthrow, to overturn, that for one reason or another, the church reaches back into history before Jesus and brings all of that stuff back into the church. And really, it comes down to the old way of doing religion, the way that Jesus came to overthrow, to set us free from. Like a universal way of doing church that you see all over the world in many forms that we could simply call the temple system. Now, the temple system represents pretty much all of the ancient religions, at least the major ones, as well as many of the religions that you look around and find in the world today. The temple system goes all the way back to Egypt. You see it in the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians. It describes the religion of the Greeks, the religion of the Romans, and even the ancient Jewish temple system. Now, the temple system has 4 components, okay, and here's what they are. The temple system has these 4 things, always these 4 things. Always has a sacred place. Okay, there's always a sacred place. There's a sacred text, some sort of sacred text. There are sacred men. And I don't know about you, have you noticed, like it's always, for some reason, it's always men? And then there are sincere followers. Okay, there's always some sincere followers. Now, I'm not sure that the followers are, always sincere. But I needed a word to describe followers that started with S. So I think you get the point, okay? I'm not judging their commitment level, but there's always followers. So in the temple system, you always have a sacred place. Okay, there's always a house of worship that in some way is considered sacred. A house, and housed in that sacred place somewhere are sacred texts. They're writings or oracles or inscriptions of some kind. And then there are always sacred men who interpret those texts. Okay, they control them. They tell people what they mean. Like, here's how you're supposed to live then. And those men, if you've noticed, have great power. Because if you don't live your life in that way, God or the gods will judge you. They might even threaten hell. And this system is still alive and well in the world today. You think about it, like in the mud hut regions of the world, you find this system all over the place. You go into a mud hut community and you will find that the most powerful person in the community is the priest, okay, or the shaman or the witch doctor. And there is some sacred place where he presides. And it might be marked with skulls or with trinkets of some kind. But everybody there knows that there is spiritual power in that place. And that power is dispensed through that man. And that man is wielding amazing power over that community, right? And of course, then you think about places like, maybe more developed places, but places like Syria and Iraq. And there are some sacred places with some sacred men interpreting sacred texts, asking people to do things that we would all agree are appalling. And so the temple system is alive and well. And what we're going to discover is that much of this temple thinking is alive and well, unfortunately, in Christian churches as well. And anyone that can stand up and say, okay, if you don't do the following, you're going to hell, that person has a tremendous amount of power. In fact, the temple system grants extraordinary power to sacred men in sacred places who determine the meaning of sacred texts. Now, if you look at that and you go, but Jason, isn't that exactly what this is? I mean, there's this sacred place, and then there's like you up there, and you're with the sacred text, and when you read it and you explain it, sometimes I see stuff that I didn't see, and usually that's pretty cool. But you tell us how to live our lives, and how is this not the temple system? In fact, isn't what you're describing everything that churches are? And I have to say, if that's what's happening in our churches are just some more temple system thinking, something is going horribly, horribly wrong. And here's why. The arrival of Jesus signaled the end of the temple system and the beginning of something entirely new. And this was not just true of those that were in the Jewish faith. For Jesus, it was true for everybody in the entire world. Now, you think about it. At the end of his ministry, he called together the disciples and he said, okay, guys, I know you love Jerusalem. I know you love the temple, and I know that you love the role of the temple in spiritual life. But I want you to leave here. I want you to go now into the whole world. I want you to go outside of Israel. I want you to go into places like Samaria and beyond and to the ends of the earth. And I know that this temple has been the epicenter of your faith, but I want you to leave. And not just to the areas where other Jews live. I want you to go to every single ethnic group, to every culture in the world. And I want you to tell them what you've seen and what you've heard and what you've experienced. Because, guys, this is for all people everywhere. See, the arrival of Jesus signaled the end of the temple system. And this is the most important part. It signaled the beginning of something entirely new. Let's say those two words together, okay? Say it with me. Entirely new. How new? Entirely new. There would be no more sacred places. You know why? Because Jesus began to teach that something else is really what's sacred. Do you know what it was? People. So when you're standing on or in what you consider to be the most sacred place, Jesus would say, hey, never be confused. The person to your left or to your right, the person in front of you or behind you is far more sacred to God than any patch of dirt or piece of architecture in the entire world. See, through Jesus, there would be no more sacred places. And there would also be no more like special designated sacred people. You no longer need a high priest or a mediator between you and God. Jesus came to put an end to all of that. And when it came to the sacred text, like the Old Testament, Jesus took all of those rules and all of those stories and all those commands, and he replaced them with a single word. Okay, this was not like Temple Model 2.0. Okay, this was a complete departure. It was brand new. And so let's just take the final couple of minutes and think together just a little bit about how brand new this actually was. First of all, Jesus initiated a new movement. One day, Jesus is walking with his guys, his disciples, and he asks them a question. And we talk about this a lot at Brookview, so it comes up a lot. But he says, who do people say that I am? And then they start throwing out some stuff. Well, some people think you're like a reincarnated, prophet that died. And Jesus is like, oh, okay. Well, who do you say that I am? And Peter, in that very famous moment, said, I think you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Jesus is like, ding, 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 winner, winner, chicken dinner. And Peter, that was so dead on that you didn't get that in and of yourself. Okay, that's from God. And then comes that famous verse, Matthew 16:18. Jesus continues, and he says, and I tell you that you are Peter, which means rock, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, the word that Jesus uses there, okay, the one that gets translated church, he says, I will build my what? Church. That Greek word in the original language was ekklesia. Okay, and guys, that word did not mean a church building. It did not mean a house of worship. It did not mean a cathedral. It meant a gathering, okay, an assembly, a congregation. Jesus said, no more sacred spaces. I'm not going to build a building or a temple. What I'm going to build is a congregation, a gathering, an assembly of people. And I will be with those people wherever they go. Now, this is a brand new era, and I am launching something brand new. So, a new movement. And then also, Jesus initiated a new covenant. And the word covenant simply means like arrangement. Jesus came to initiate a new arrangement with God. Okay, before the new covenant, like you had to have a high priest. And someone would have to go to God on your behalf. Why? Because you're not holy enough. Got to have a mediator. But Jesus says, okay, now I'm establishing a brand new covenant. The old approach to God, it is over. Regardless of your religion, like regardless of the name that you have inscribed above your temple, regardless of your deity or your deities, a new day has come. God has opened the way for all people to approach him directly. Because the final sacrifice for sin is about to be made for everybody, everywhere. Now, here's what he said. It says, in the same way after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant, okay, the new arrangement in my blood, which is poured out for you. And you think about this from the disciples' perspective, they're probably going like, huh? Like, what do you mean a new covenant? What's wrong with the old covenant? And what do you mean in your blood? You're just like sitting here with us. Okay, there's no blood. What is it, Jesus, that you're talking about? And Jesus would say, like, guys, just hang on. Okay, you're going to see. And after watching him then bleed on a Roman cross, eventually it would dawn on them, this is the final sacrifice for sin. And it's not just for us Jews. This is for all mankind. So like all of the animals that were sacrificed all of those years, it was all preparing the way for this moment, the ultimate sacrifice. And now, see, everybody is free to walk with God, to enter a relationship with God. No more priests, no more mediators, no more sacrifices, no more temples, just forgiven people learning to walk with God. And then Jesus gave new meaning to the sacred text. One day he was reading it, and to most of us, like we read this and we just kind of read right past this. But this is one of those many things where when Jesus said this, it's like the crowd gasped and went silent. Like these were the kinds of things that those that opposed Jesus wanted to stone him over. Jesus said, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. Okay, so basically the entire Old Testament, the Bible up until that time. He says, I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. Now that was a big statement. Jesus claimed that the entire Old Testament was ultimately about him. That somehow all of it funneled down to him. That all of the prophets were preparing the way for him, that the entire sacrificial system was in a way pointing to him. Jesus was saying, look, the entire Old Testament was simply a directional sign that was pointing all of you to me. I mean, it's no wonder they wanted to stone him. Like, are you serious? He was doing something unthinkable. He was doing something completely brand new, and they knew it. And in looking back on it, the Apostle Paul, about 20 years later, would write, he was right. Guys, he was so right. The entire law, the entire Old Testament was like a tutor that was bringing us to a place where we were ready to graduate from needing a tutor to being introduced to our Savior. It's like the old law was simply guardrails to get us to the place where we could be introduced to the Christ, to the Messiah. See, it's through the entire Old Testament, like all the stories and all the poetry and all the richness, the entire Old Testament was like, it's like a cocoon. And from that cocoon, the Savior of the world was birthed. And while that cocoon, for a season, played an incredibly important role, like this massive role in the faith of people trying to love God, once it was finished, it was finished. And Jesus was saying, it is all finished because in me it's all fulfilled. And then Jesus initiated a new movement-defining ethic. Jesus said every law, every teaching in the Old Testament was about one thing. Can you imagine that? Like, there's a lot of words in the Old Testament. He says that it all boils down to one thing. And what is that one thing? Love. Again, a very famous passage. A teacher of the law comes to Jesus, and he's not a friend. He's trying to get Jesus in trouble. But he says, hey, Jesus, let's see if we can mess him up on this one. What's the most important command? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says all the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. Okay, like the whole Old Testament can be very simply boiled down to these two things. Love God with everything that you are, and love other people the way that you love yourself. This is it. Jesus said, this is the whole deal. And on the last night before his death, he gathered his closest followers. And he said to him, a new command I give you. A new command. A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. Like, this is it. Like, this is the command. Love one another. And when you think about it, Jesus set the bar kind of high. He said, do it as I have loved you. Ooh. And in that moment, he had just washed the disciples' feet, right? He had just done the unthinkable. As the Savior, as the King, as God in the flesh, as the Messiah, he took the position of the lowest slave. He served them by washing their feet. They're arguing around the table about which one of them is the greatest. And Jesus is like, really? What can I do to teach you guys? So he gets down on a knee, he takes a towel, puts it over his arm, and he begins washing their disgusting feet. And they couldn't believe it. They could not believe it. And then he said, guys, this is the way. This, from now on, is how authority is to be handled. You use it to serve. And he's looking around the room, and he's like, do you understand? And I think they're like, yeah. You never lord it over people. You never lord it over people. You humbly serve. This is the way. This is my way. There will be no more sacred people in sacred places powering up on people. Just leaders who learn how to serve with the greatest humility. And then the next day, you think about this. The next day, they would watch him lay down his life. They would watch him allow himself to be nailed to a Roman cross. And those words would take on a deeper meaning. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And Jesus said, this is what will define my movement. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. And he continues, he says, by this, everyone will know that you're my disciples. Why? Because that kind of love is crazy. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. How is it that people should know that we belong to Jesus? Is it because we got a really funny or clever or sacred bumper sticker? Is it because we wear a cross? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. How should people know that we belong to Jesus? They should know because our love should be obvious. Jesus said that the whole deal can be summed up with this: love God, love one another, and love your enemy. And this was a brand new ethic. Nobody else was trying to do this. Love your enemies? Are you serious? Love would replace law keeping. Self-sacrifice would replace animal sacrifice. Okay, the vertical, our love for God, would now be measured ultimately by the horizontal, how well we love one another. It was a total departure from temple thinking. And Jesus is saying, if you want to be holy, don't look at how much time you spend in church. Don't look at how much scripture you've memorized. Don't look at how well you pray, how long you pray, how fancy you pray. Here's what you look at, and this is the only thing you look at. How well do you love people? And finally, Jesus gave new meaning to the most sacred Jewish event. And I don't think that we can fully appreciate how shocking this was to Jewish men sitting around a table. Now, we sit here in our culture, in our day, and we can read right past this, but like to us, these can just become like words on a page, and we've heard it over and over if we've been in the church. But this was staggering. Jesus gave new meaning to Passover. Jesus took a 1,400-year-old tradition. It went back 1,400 years by the time of Jesus, which was a long time ago. This Passover, the most sacred and significant celebration for Jewish people, and he redefined it. He made it all about himself. And I was trying to think of a comparison, like what this would be like in our day. And here's like the best thing that, this is kind of lame, but this is the best thing I can come up with. One of my heroes in the faith is a guy named Bill Hybels. How many of you have heard of Bill Hybels? Yeah, he's like a pioneer in rethinking church, doing the best that we can to try to get back to what Jesus had in mind. And possibly, I think, probably the most influential Christian of our generation. When we met people in Russia, they had met Bill Hybels because he was there teaching church leaders there. I was pretty amazed. It's like, man, I never met Bill Hybels. But he's like a hero to me, okay? I love this guy. But imagine that his organization, okay, the Willow Creek Association, came out with a statement tomorrow that Bill Hybels has declared that from here on, Christmas is to be a celebration of his birth. Okay, that from here on, when we celebrate Christmas, we will celebrate the birth of Bill Hybels. There might be some resistance to that. People might say, no. Or, okay, put this in a little different context. What if Pope Francis had an idea? And everybody loves Pope Francis, right? Well, what if Francis, at the end of his term as Pope, comes out with a statement? And he's just like, hey, because of the significance of my popehood, like everything that's changed, and because I am loved by so many people, and I know you want to remember me, so after I go to be with the Lord, from now on, make Easter, okay, when you all come together to celebrate Easter, make it about me and my death and my going home because of my great influential life. Imagine if you're a disciple in that moment. That's like, okay, Jesus. Like, we've been really flexible. And like, we've left everything to follow you. And it's been, at times it's been really hard and it's been really confusing, but we've rolled with it. We've been with you through thick and thin. And don't get us wrong, there's been lots of really cool stuff. Like all the miracles, the calming the storm thing, that was pretty cool. Like the mud in the blind guy's eyes, didn't see that coming. Neither did he. Pretty awesome. And so anyway, you know we're with you. You know we're with you, but this is Passover, man. And you're Jesus, man. Okay, you're not Moses. And just going like Jesus, Moses was awesome. Moses freed our entire nation. Jesus, who have you freed? And Jesus is like, okay, hang on. Yeah, but see, Moses saved all of Israel. Who have you saved? Okay, wait a minute. Guys, when Jesus took Passover and he made it all about himself, you think about it, they should have got up and left the room. They should have left skid marks. It should have been the end of the movement of Jesus. But this was Jesus' most dramatic way of saying, okay, what we're doing here is not the continuation of something. This is not Temple System 2.0. This is the beginning of something entirely new. Again, the arrival of Jesus signaled the end of the temple system and the beginning of something what? Entirely new. How new? Entirely new. There would be no more sacred places, no more sacred special people. Okay, the Old Testament would be completely fulfilled. All of its laws and all of its teachings and all of its stories would be reduced to a single verb that would be applied to God and to our neighbors and even to our enemies. And after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, the church took this and they ran with it. And they got off to an amazing start. And then, over time, some temple thinking started to get sprinkled back in. Jesus' following started to get all mixed up with temple thinking. And some of the things that should have been left behind got blended right back into this new movement. Some traditions and some attitudes and some systems that were tied to the old way, they just couldn't let go. And they went back to the old stuff. And unfortunately, much of that temple system thinking is still actively a part of the church today. And guys, this is the primary reason that we are unnecessarily resistible. And it's critical that we figure this out. It's critical that we learn to let go of the things that are holding us back. That we learn to fully embrace what it is that Jesus had in mind. Like when he said, this is something new. Like guys, you don't pour new wine into old wineskins. This isn't Temple System 2.0. So let me close with 3 questions. How in the world did temple system thinking enter back in? Why in the world would they allow that? And how is it continuing to affect the way that we behave, the way that we think about spiritual life? And how in the world do we get back to what it is that Jesus had in mind? Well, I just want to say, next week, we're going to start in on a little journey on this. And I hope you're here with us. And if you're not, it's going to be online. But I hope you're here with us. Not because being in church is what makes you spiritual.